still do some consulting work with a select number of agencies, and to me, it seems that the pendulum is swinging away from the BDAs and the conglomerates because there's more and more opportunity for, you know, entrepreneurial people who are concerning themselves with what communication, I won't even call it advertising anymore, what communication is all about. WPP in the last, since they've been in business, which is about 16, 17 years now, has bought 682 companies, of which 312 no longer exist. So they buy these companies, the liposuction the life out of them, the owners of the agency cash in after their non-compete clause is over, and then just move on and start another agency. And the agencies of today, I think, that are really going to make it are two of my favorites. Well, I've got half a dozen, but two in particular, Droga 5 in New York, who I do some work with, and also a small hot agency in Boise, Idaho, believe it or not, called Drake Cooper, because I live in Boise, Idaho now. I moved there from New York quite a few years ago. And when I did, all my friends in New York said, so where are you living now? And I'd say, Boise, Idaho. And they'd say, well, what do you want to live in the Midwest for? And isn't it all flat and potato farms? And I'd say, yeah, and it's full of Nazis too, so stay the fuck away. Unfortunately, it's full of Californians now who've sold their Mac mansions. Anyway, oh, and the other mention I gave you there, the agency of Tomorrow that died after 2 years was the, you may have heard of Enfatico, which was an agency created by WPP to handle the Dell account globally. And they hired like over 1,000 people. They took a 10-year lease on an office on Madison Avenue. And within 2 years, they were out of business. And they never produced a single campaign for Dell. That's what happens when you're dealing with the conglomerates and the BDAs. Okay, so I'm going to tell you some stories now, some of which are relevant and some are just fun, hopefully. Some of the pictures that you'll see here, Piers insisted I dig up some really old pictures which were taken long before every person in this room was even born, and probably your parents as well. This is me on the Queen Mary, because when I first came to America as a student, that was the cheapest way to go. And the lady sat next to me was a South African lady who was taking her idiot daughter around the world to try and get him married off. I don't think she succeeded, but her and I had a few adventures at sea. Anyway, I was only 22 at the time, so you can't blame me. And it's true, you know, there's something about, I don't know about cruise lines, but ocean-going liners has a very strange effect on women. Okay. So when I arrived in New York, and I knew nobody, but I had managed to get an interview with David Ogilvy, who was, you know, the great British man of American advertising. This was like in 1962 when I first came. And he very graciously gave me a 20-minute interview. And at the end of it, I said, oh, Mr. Ogilvy, one last question. And he said, what's that, dear boy? And I said, well, I've only been off the boat like 3 or 4 days, and I know nothing about America, and certainly not the American advertising industry. So I have no idea if somebody offers me a job, how much salary I should ask for. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, how much money should I ask for? And he said, dear boy, I never discuss money. I have people who work for me who discuss money. You'll have to talk to them. I thought, shit, it's like the Queen, you know, or the president. You don't even have to carry money around. Anyway, I next saw him 25 years later in Ogilvy, because I used to do a lot of freelance for Ogilvy, particularly on IBM. And we were there one night working late. There was a whole mob of us that had been gathered from all over the place. They were trying to save the Compaq account, which of course was a futile exercise. And we're in this conference room one night drinking cold beer, drinking warm beer, eating cold pizza and doing drugs and shit like that. It was in the 80s, remember? And the door bursts open and in walks David Ogilvy. Well, he kind of staggered because he was in his 80s then. And he was also stone deaf, so he shouted. And he said, what the hell are you lot doing? So we hit the drugs and everything else and said, well, we're working on the Compaq thing, you know. And he said, oh, actually, I forgot to say, when I first met him in '62, When I was leaving, he banged on the desk and he said, "Never forget, advertising is all about selling," right? So then when I met him again in the 80s, as he was leaving the room, he banged on the desk and said, "Never forget, advertising is about selling." So I had a kind of one-track mind, you know. Anyway, so that was my meeting David twice. By the way, a lot of more stuff than this with a lot more sex, drugs, rock and roll is in my current book, Confessions of a Madman. Oh, that's me when I was made a vice president when I was at Benton & Bowles. And I wrote my mother in England and told her I'd been made a vice president. And she wrote back and said how happy she was that I was the #2 man in the agency now. I didn't have the heart to tell her there were 500 vice presidents, and they gave you that instead of a raise. Still do these days, anyway. So when I finally came back, because I was in America for 6 months, and then I went back to England for a year, and then I came back to America, and I got a job at Benton & Bowles. And my boss there was a guy called Joe Arlio, who was about 5 years older than me, but always called me Kid. And he was a quintessential madman. The clothes, smoking, drinking, screwing, and everything else. Anyway, and one of the accounts that I worked on, believe it or not, was Charmin bathroom tissues. By the way, Procter & Gamble would kill you if you ever called them toilet rolls. They're bathroom tissues. And I had to, back in those days, Mr. Whipple, I didn't invent him, he'd been invented before I arrived, but there was, at that time, there was actually 2 campaigns for Charmin. There was Mr. Whipple, who used to run around his supermarket forbidding little old ladies to squeeze the Charmin, and there was another guy called the Shy Salesman, who used to go around, knock on the door of the house door of like little old ladies, because they're like the prime target for bathroom tissues. And he would like stumble and let go of the pack of Charmin that he had, and it would float off in the air because it had puffs of air softness in it, right? Yeah, we used to do shit like that. Well, a lot of agencies still do, actually. The number of times I like put the television on and look at something and it's like the same shit I did 200 years ago, but it's a lot of CGI and great production values now. Anyway, so I had to go out to California for 2 weeks to shoot some spots, and in those days there was hardly any film business in New York. We did everything in Hollywood. And I used to, when I'd go out, I'd stay at a Hilton or a great Best Western or something like that. But I couldn't go for 2 weeks, I could only go for a week. So Joe said, "I'll go out and do the first week, and then you come out and take over my hotel." I said, okay, so I flew out LAX, got in a cab. I only had the name of the hotel on a piece of paper, and it was the Bel Air Hotel. Well, if you've ever been to the Bel Air or seen it, it's like one of the world's ultimate luxury hotels. Certainly was then, you know, peacocks walking around and swans on lakes and shit like that. And so I checked in, and the guy behind the desk said, the bellboy will take your luggage up to Mr. Arlio's poolside chalet, and then you're to meet him in the dining room for dinner. So I go up to this chalet, which is like a house with like 5 bedrooms and a bar bigger than that screen. And so I get washed up, and then I go down to the restaurant, and Joe is sat at the far end, and the table is covered in like champagne buckets and cigars and shit like that. And on one side is the world's most beautiful blonde, and on the other side is the world's most beautiful redhead. And Joe said, "Hi, kid, which one do you want?" So I chose the redhead. Anyway, and I said to Joe later in the evening, "How do you get away with it?" You know, because he had like a white Cadillac convertible parked outside the chalet and all that shit. And he said, "What do you mean, get away with it?" I said, "Well, this must cost a fortune." And he said, "Kid, when you're away from your loved ones, you have to make the bastards pay." And this light bulb went on in my head, and that became my ruling dictate for the rest of my career on Madison Avenue. Anyway, so one of the other accounts that I worked, oh, by the way, on Mr. Whipple, who was a really charming guy called Dick Wilson, who's dead now, he was the longest running character in commercial television, played by the same person. because he did the spots for like something like 32 years or something like that, became a millionaire. And the interesting fact about him is that Mr. Whipple, and I'm sure you've seen some of the spots, the old spots and so on, who was this little nubbly old man who'd like berate little old ladies, was actually he was a Canadian who was in the Canadian Royal Air Force and was a highly decorated Spitfire pilot in the Battle of Britain. Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, one of the other accounts that I had at Dorland's, at Benton Bowles, was Maxwell House Coffee. And I used to shoot all the spots with a guy called Michael Cimino. Anybody know the name, recognize the name? He went on to become a very famous film director. And he actually made, what was it? The Deer Hunter was his most famous picture. And then he went on and made Heaven's Gate and blew his career apart because he was like an idiot. Anyway, he had like two major faults. One was that he always lied about his age, even though he was only like 29 or 30, he was not 4 or 5 years old. And he always lied about his height, because he was almost a midget. He was about that big. He was even smaller than Sir Martin Sorrell, who I always refer to on the blog as the poison dwarf. And so Mike, but his major fault was, and this was his downfall when he made Heaven's Gate, he couldn't stop shooting film. He would make take after take after take after take. Anyway, so we're doing these Maxwell House spots, and one of them involved a couple walking along a beach with their dog, and then they go home and enjoy the coffee moment, as General Foods always call it. And so the thing was, and we wanted to, as they walked along the beach, it was early in the morning, and the dog was running up and down, and the dog would chase off a pile of seagulls who would then fly into the sky. So we got a bird wrangler in, because if you've ever shot film in Hollywood, you have wranglers who wrangle like cockroaches, snakes, lions, whatever. There's always a wrangler that'll do it. So we got the bird wrangler in, and he said, well, there's only one problem. He said, I can train virtually any bird in the world except seagulls, because they're real obstinate bastards and just won't take orders. He said, but don't worry. He said, if you shoot into the sun, so it's the early morning sun, so they're in silhouette, we'll use crows or something like that. Okay, so we did that. So we dug a big hole in the beach, and the union guy who digs the holes did that. Then the other union guy who covers it up did that. And then the other union guy who pulls the sheet, because everybody in Hollywood film business has a very specific job. That's why it costs a fortune to shoot there. Anyway, so they're walking along the beach, and the dog runs up, and they pull the tarpaulin off the hole in the beach, and all these crows fly off into the sun. Beautiful, beautiful shot. So, okay, that was it. And then Mike said, okay, bring the birds back, and we'll do another. And the wrangler said, what do you mean, bring them back? They've gone. He said, well, where have they gone? He went, home. He said, where's home? He said, my ranch, 2 hours drive away. He went, go and get them. So he did that 3 times. Took like all day just to get this one shot. And when we looked at the dailies that night, the first shot was perfect anyway. And then it ended up on the cutting room floor because the client wanted more of the coffee moment than birds in the sky. Okay. Are you giving me the yank yet? Not yet, no. Okay. The other, I also claim credit, believe it or not, for the most expensive shoot ever up until that time. The most expensive commercial ever for its time was obviously 1984. Oh, by the way, I had an email the other day from a lady professor at a school I shall not mention who teaches MBAs, which is a plague on the earth. And she, as part of her course, she has a list of the 10 most famous and expensive commercials in the world, right? 1984 wasn't even on it. So, the MBAs are like, anyway. So I did this thing, and it was for when I was back in England, because I moved back to England in the 70s, and it was for McVitie's biscuits, which, as Piers will know, biscuits are cookies in England, and it was to use ingredients from all over the world. So I went on this 7-week shoot throughout the Caribbean and South America, all over the place. And I had to go out 2 weeks before and do all the recce's. So, and we managed, you know, because there was so much we could do, make it look like Africa, so you can have like cocoa beans, and then you have coffee beans in Colombia, and we're in Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, all over the place. But we needed shots of wheat fields. And at this time of the year, there was no wheat growing in England or anywhere like that. But we were told there was wheat growing in a place called Tucapita, which is like 2,000 miles up the Orinoco from Caracas. So I had to fly out there, and I got an Aeropostale plane, then a small plane. Then I was picked up in a village by the world, some UN guy who was the agricultural bloke there. And we drove for about an hour, and then we came out of this jungle, and there was like this swamp as far as you could see. As far as the eye could see, just this fetid swamp. And I said, "Where's the wheat?" And he said, "Wheat?" I said, "Yeah, where's the wheat?" He said, "No, we grow rice here." I said, "Well, I was told Tucapita was where the wheat grew in Venezuela." He said, "That would be the other Tucapita." So I said, "Where's that?" And he said, "It's about 3,000 miles on the Colombian border." I said, "Oh, shit, okay, take me back to the plane." And he said, "The plane won't be back for 3 days." So I was stuck in this, like, Jesus, horrible place for like 3 days, drinking Pisco, which is the local brandy, which is like fucking antifreeze. But it was the only thing I could do. And it was literally guys with sombreros asleep and everything else. So that was, and the thing was, we actually shot the wheat in Tucapita on the Colombian border, and it was so bad that we couldn't use it. So when we got back to England, we bought some stock footage for like £25 and put that in, and it was great, you know. But the client was looking at the rough cuts, and he went, "Ooh, that's interesting." I said, "What?" He said, he said, "Where did you shoot this?" I said, "Venezuela." Because I wasn't going to tell him it was a piece of stock footage. He said, "But there's like an English church in the background over there." And I said, being quick, "Well, interesting, you should pick that up, because there were a lot of English settlers there who moved over in the early 19th century, and they recreated a bit of England." Great. Okay, one final thing. Okay, one final thing that I learned many years ago. By the way, there's tons of this in Confessions of a Madman. If you don't buy it, I'll kill Piers for a start. And it's $4.99 on Amazon. You can even play it on your iToys, you know. So one of the things I learned about in this business is to be very precise and very hard. Years ago in California, I was making a presentation to a client, and the client, this was before the internet, so we used to do lots and lots of copy for the technology people, lots of speeds and feeds, as they used to call it. And the client said, "Ooh, there's a lot of copy there." And I said, "Yeah, well, let's take some out." He went, "Oh, no, we've got to have all the speeds and feeds in there." So he said, "I know, I have an idea. Why don't we bullet point the copy?" And I said, no. And he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, there's a study just been released by the Institute of Cognitive Data Metrics that proves that bullet point copy is 78.63% harder to read than regular galley set copy." And he went, "Oh, okay." When we came out, the account guy said to me, where did you read that?" I said, "I just made it up." But you have to be precise, which is why when I said WPP has bought 682 companies, 312 are no longer existing, I just made it up.